Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. We are well over 100 podcasts. We'd like to thank all of our viewers and listeners for supporting us over these last 5 years. And today we're tackling, as we always strive to do, a very breaking, important story in the world of sports and entertainment risk and law, NIL. And one of the first lawsuits dealing with what happens when a player moves from one school to another? How does it affect their NIL license or their NIL deal, I should say, their contract? To discuss that, we've got Shak Rashad with us. Shak is a former linebacker from Jacksonville, Florida. He now lives in Charleston. He played at the University of North Carolina and also spent a season with the Houston Texans in the NFL. He then returned to Chapel Hill to coach at UNC. Off the field, he has worked across college athletics at Teamworks and athletes.org. He previously ran the UNC football collective Heels for Life, so very topical. Today, he is the senior football advisor and business development on the collegiate team, I should say, at Players Health. Players Health is well known to our viewers and listeners as the home of our advisory board member, Jason DeMarco. And Shaq, welcome to the SERMAPod.
Yeah, great to be here. I'm excited. Thanks for having me.
All right, so recently this story broke where Darian Mensah, who was a quarterback at Duke, he was paid a $4 million deal, NIL deal, name, image, and likeness deal. And he, in the transfer portal, transferred to the University of Miami, who was recently the runner up in the national championship to Indiana, very prominent program, of course. And the question was, what happens to his NIL deal? Well, Duke was very interested in that deal because they initiated a lawsuit alleging damages because of this move. They lost their star quarterback to another program, and they had a deal from their perspective. And let's dive right into that. Give us a little more background on Darian Mensah, who he was, and why he's such a key figure.
Yeah, I mean, first off, he was an elite quarterback, right? And I think that's where this all starts. Is that 2021, July 1st, 2021 is NIL goes into effect, and then July 1st of this past year, revenue share goes into effect. And so not only can these athletes make money off of their name, image, and likeness, now the school can directly compensate them for it. And obviously, as those things happen, elite athletes, there's going to be people that are vying for their services, trying to get them to come to their schools. And so, like you mentioned, those NIL deals, the revenue share, NIL licensing deals, what they're doing is they're licensing Darian, in this case, is NIL, his name, image, likeness, to be able to get him to come to the school, compete for that team. And so he started off, if I'm not mistaken, at Tulane a couple years ago and entered the transfer portal out of that school with the goal of finding a new home, landed at Duke. And from what I understand, it was actually a multi-year deal, which is where some of the issues in this come into play, that he still had a year technically under contract right here, which is where those damages come into play and everything. But ultimately, I think the part that really sits at the center of this is that multi-year contract, and he is an absolutely elite quarterback. That Miami, having lost Carson Beck, looking to make another run at the national championship, they're out there looking for a quarterback. There were some reports on people that they had gone after, maybe missed in the transfer portal prior to Mensah entering. But once that happened, it was very clear that they were making a strong push for him, and it's kind of led us to where we're at now with the lawsuit. I believe there was a settlement in the case now. And so I think that while this individual case is kind of reaching its resolution, I think it's indicative of what could be happening in the future and what the landscape is looking like right now, realistically, for some of these top tier talents.
All right, let's jump into that because there's a couple of interesting things that you mentioned. So, NIL contract, NIL deal, NIL agreement. What does that mean? Who are the parties to that contract? Is it between the individual and the school? Is it between the individual and a collective? How does that work?
Yeah, now we're getting into the juicy stuff. And the answer is yes, and yes, and yes, and yes, and yes. And I say that kind of with a smile on my face because
Sure.
these deals are structured in a lot of different ways. Right
Right.
now, there's a $20.5 million cap on what schools can share in terms of their revenue share with their athletes. That is not solely dedicated to football. It's actually not even explicitly said by the NCAA or by conferences how that money is to be allocated. School really gets the opportunity to decide that themselves. And so where one school may be putting 15 million into football and then the other 5.5 million into two or three other sports, you don't have to do that, right? And so it could go any which way. What that presents is the opportunity to put a lot of this money on rev share, but in some cases, players are also having to do NIL deals outside of it. So with that, I'll circle back and say for a guy like a Darian Mensah, pretty reasonable to expect that a significant amount of his money is coming from rev share from the school. So that would be a deal where the parties are he and Duke. But then separately, if the school has a collective, the school has a multimedia rights partner, if the school has an apparel partner, if there's someone in Durham that just wants to do a deal with Darian Mensah, now you can also have these outside NIL deals where there are separate parties. But the one that's being addressed in this case specifically is the deal with Duke.
Okay, so that's important because Mensah, by the way, who led Duke to the ACC championship, right? He had signed his 2-year deal with Duke in July of 2025. As you mentioned, it ran through 2026, which is next season. Mensah is not an employee that has not, there's these players are not yet employees of university. He's not an employee. So this was a regular employment contract. It might be easier. It might be easier to argue that he violated his employment contract by moving from one employer to the next. He's not an employee, right? So what he actually contracted with Duke was to allow them exclusive rights to market his name, image, and likeness. But what does that mean if he no longer plays for Duke? Arguably, Duke preserves that right to market his NIL as a Hurricane, right? And that's
Right.
kind of where the problem exists.
Right, and that's really where a lot of the issues came, because if you remember, as the temporary restraining order was put in place, he was in the transfer portal, and they're like, "We can't stop you from being in the portal. There's actually a duty of the school. Once an athlete requests to be in the portal, the duty is that they have to put them in within 48 hours." So he's in the portal, but he can't really land anywhere, right? Because at the next landing spot, what'll happen is now he cannot license his NIL because Duke still has those exclusive rights. And so really that was at the center of what was trying to get figured out. There's actually a situation out at Washington recently that was kind of similar. Not all the facts were the exact same, but quarterback enters a transfer portal. There's a little bit of a fuss back and forth. He retained an attorney and almost immediately, like, went back to the school. I can't say specifically like what happened in that case. I don't know all the details, but exclusive licensing rights were a factor in that as well, from what I understand. And it's just saying we may not be able to stop you from getting in the portal, but we can cause some real issues legally with you licensing your NIL rights again, wherever it is you land next, which would obviously
Right.
present an issue in terms of getting paid.
We'll get into that in a sec. I mean, basically, Duke argued in their complaint that this is a simple contract, that he contracted for one thing with Duke and he left. Therefore, they are damaged. We'll get into that in a second, but explain to our listeners and viewers a little bit about the transfer portal because most of us understand it basically, but tell us, like, sort of walk us through what happens when a player decides to enter the transfer portal. If they don't have an NIL deal, it's pretty simple, right? They enter the portal. What happens then? And then we'll get into what happens if you do have a deal.
Yeah, so if you don't have an NIL deal, like if you're in a position to be able to leave, what happens is you would go to your compliance officer, your university, whoever's been designated there, and then you're just telling them, "Hey, I'd like to enter my name in the transfer portal." Within 48 hours, your name enters that portal, and at that point, you start making contact with other schools. You can start to have those conversations, and it's not really considered that tampering at that point. And then from there, what happens a lot of times is players start making trips. They're flying all over the country, trying to figure out where they want to go. Things happen really quickly. Oftentimes, if it's an elite player, their agent is also having conversations in terms of, "Hey, if this player were to land here, what does a contract look like?" And they're really working through the fine print, the details, all those things as they're deciding. I think an important factor to remember, though, is that the transfer portal window is like a 15-day window. That is when you can enter the portal. You don't necessarily have to be out of it by then. So long as you enter it, which Mensa did before the portal closes, you don't necessarily have to land at your next school before the portal closes. You can still land afterwards. And in fact, right now, there are thousands of players that are still sitting in the portal. I think that's an important factor here. Is like I was a coach when the transfer portal came into effect. It's a mess. Like, there are software services out there now that do a good job of cleaning this information out and letting you be able to filter and kind of drill down and find what you're looking for. But coaches are really sitting there, in a lot of cases, having to sift and filter through tens of thousands of athletes and trying to figure out, is this a fit? Is this a fit? Is this a fit? And in all reality, like, there are a lot of players that enter that portal that don't come out. So the whole thing ends up being I don't want to say a mess, but it's pretty chaotic for a couple weeks.
And
And we've seen that in the way we've worked with partners recently too. Sorry, go ahead.
and to that point, I mean, a lot of the reason it's a mess is because there is no broad rules. There is no
Right.
standard, right, for all of this, which we've heard a lot of prominent coaches complaining about. But I want to ask you a question. So when you enter the portal, are schools allowed to actively offer you NIL deals? I mean, that's the whole point, right? Most of these elite athletes are shopping their services to the highest bidder. That's allowed. That's permissible, correct?
Correct. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so now you can be recruited with those NIL deals from the school. I think it's really important to kind of point out the difference, though, because this actually was recently an issue with the CSC. The schools, you can be working through that, having conversation with them. but the schools cannot promise third party NIL money at that time.
Uh,
And so it does kind of introduce a little bit of a curveball there where you remember at the top of this, we were talking about how a lot of these rosters now, they cost more than what the school is allocating to the team in rev share. And so we saw schools over this past cycle where they were looking for head coaches and they promised X amount of money will be available to you for a roster. If you compare that number, in a lot of cases, it's bigger than the 20.5. So it's safe to assume that some of that money has to come from outside money that's not directly from the university. Well, in those cases, that's where it gets a little muddy of saying, well, how can you promise what this player is going to make when it's not all coming from rev share because you can't promise third party money, which goes back to your point of not having uniform rules and not having really, I'd say, certainty and clarity all the way through for a lot of folks.
and Shaq, what adds to the mess is that there's you mentioned the window is relatively short and there's a race. I mean, we're talking about, let's say the top 15 or 20 quarterbacks, the most important position in the country. And we saw with Indiana how quickly a program could literally go from like zero to hero on the back of a star quarterback. Mendoza won the Heisman. He had one of the greatest seasons ever in college. I mean, that's because of the quarterback. So the pressure is on more than ever to, once the window opens, grab these elite quarterbacks, adding to this whole, discussion that we're having, right?
Absolutely. It's absolutely on there. And I think that what you talked about there actually uncovers something else too. There's an immense amount of payoff, which means that people are willing to risk a lot. Like people are willing to spend a lot of money on quarterbacks and elite players in the transfer portal. Those decisions happen very fast. And in a lot of cases, these GMs, these coaches, they're making decisions relatively blind, right? You don't have time if there's 15, 20, 30 schools that are going after the same quarterback. You may not have time to ask all the questions, do all the diligence that you would usually do. So they're making decisions really quickly in a lot of cases without all the information that they would need to have to be able to make that decision confidently.
So one of those questions that perhaps Miami could have asked if they were spending more time or had more time is, do you have a rock solid contract with another university that might result in a lawsuit? So let's dive back into the lawsuit. So it's important to note that Duke wasn't suing Miami. They weren't a party to it. They were seeking, as you mentioned, a restraining order to prevent Mensah from entering the portal, right? Um, and eventually, wow, about a couple Tuesdays ago, that case was settled. Now, we don't know the terms of the settlement, but presumably it involved something going back to Duke. They weren't giving that case up, I presume. Duke has pretty smart people, pretty smart lawyers. You would think they got something considerable back for giving up, what could be the key to Miami maybe, getting back and perhaps winning next year. We don't know how much that money was, but presumably it was a lot and, somewhat close to the deal they gave Mensah in the first place.
Presumably, it was a lot. That's absolutely correct. And it's not even just thinking about what it is they're losing and losing him and what the money had already paid out to him was. You're also thinking about like the difference that you just mentioned, right? Like the right quarterback can change everything really quickly. Duke was just in the ACC championship. They just had an elite quarterback. A CFP playoff berth is worth a lot of money to a university. If you get one of those home games in the CFP, that's a lot of money to the town. And so, like, that is making a massive economic difference to those towns. Like, I went to school at North Carolina where if basketball didn't play deep enough into the year, stores on Franklin Street were closing. Like they're depending on that revenue coming in. And so that's why this is such a big conversation for a lot of people because it wins and losses are everything. I'm from Florida. And so like college football was everything to me growing up. But even past just the fandom of it, it is an economic factor in so many towns that like people are thinking about this and much bigger than just wins, losses individually. They're seeing these as like dollars and cents, and significant dollars and cents in a lot of cases,
And
especially with Indiana, what they just did.
right, exactly. And you understand, I understand, I think anyone would Duke's position that they entered into a deal in good faith and they, held up their end of the bargain in this contract and they paid him and they didn't get what was promised. On the other hand, I think you have to recognize that these athletes have a limited window and the rules are such that allow them finally to profit from their NIL and they should be allowed some freedom. That's what the transfer portal is there for. But, that's where this, disagreement came in. You also, as we know, in any legal action, have to prove damages, right? And what Duke was claiming, to your point, is that they were losing out in not only the terms of the contract, but all the ancillary benefits from having a star quarterback and a successful program. After all, they were coming off a really successful ACC season.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, and you mentioned, and I'll just double down on it again. quarterback makes everything else go. I often talk about it as like if you're a coach, like your quarterback's almost like kind of you can think of it as an insurance policy on every other dollar you spend on the roster. You can have great receivers and great defense and all those other things. If your quarterback can't figure it out and can't manage the game for you, nothing else matters. And so this is a significant hit on that Duke team. I don't think that it's difficult to look at and understand that they did have a huge loss in this.
So learning from this, I have talked to a bunch of people about this and have done a couple podcasts. I mean, obviously, one takeaway is make the contract language as strong as possible. That's just basic, common sense that you have to put language in there that deals with this potential more than ever. And if there is movement, then you have to spell out exactly what the damages are that are coming back to you. Again, I don't think you're going to be allowed to restrict someone from entering the transfer portal, but you could certainly put some severe penalties that you contract for in there in the contract.
That's absolutely correct, and I think the other piece of it too that should and like people are starting to work through now and understand what it all looks like in the future is the way that those buyouts effectively happen, right? Like if the buyout comes from the other university, that actually does hit their cap for the next year. And so those being built in as a mechanism within this new system does help this. But if the buyout comes from the player himself or herself, my understanding is that that's not hitting the cap. And so that's another piece of this where it adds a factor and a layer where it may not be advantageous for a university to take on that buyout if it's going to hit their cap and get to a spot that it's damaging the rest of their roster. But if that player can handle it, well, in that case, maybe we're looking at this a little bit different. But yeah, I think that the portal side of this is caused a lot of confusion for a lot of folks.
Yeah, and then another piece of it legally is like to what extent. I don't think Miami. I think Miami got out of this. I mean, obviously they're probably paying part of the settlement. But the question is, to what extent does a university face exposure, even if it's not technically part of an NIL deal? That's going to be an issue going forward. And I don't know if this settlement makes these lawsuits more or less likely to happen. I think you could argue on both sides, but it certainly makes these contracts, not as strong as probably Duke thought it was going to be.
I think these contracts are a focal point for a lot of people right now. And I think like people are just getting their first go at it, right? Like the first time that these rev share contracts were written from the school was July 1st of 2025. And so now like we're going to see iterations of it. We're going to see different versions of them. I think that one thing that we've seen is like a lot of our partners have really taken interest in our transfer protection policies. And they're taking interest in that because they're looking at these and saying, I don't know how enforceable some of these contracts are. Like, I don't know what these buyouts look like. And so as we're out there talking to schools about these things, it's top of mind for them too. And so I know that the whole country, really from the athletic department side, was watching this Duke one, was watching Washington, trying to see how these things played out and what they may need to think about in terms of their own contracts.
Shak Rashad from Players Health, thank you so much for joining the SERMAPod and for bringing some light to this emergent and always interesting issue. Please come back in the future.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.